There are moments when a room falls silent for reasons no one can explain. Not because anyone spoke, not because the lights went out, but because something unseen seemed to step into the space. That was the first thing I noticed on the night everything changed. My name is Miriam Okoye. I grew up in eastern Nigeria, in a village where old legends were treated as history and whispered stories carried more weight than written books. As a child, I dismissed many of those tales as fear passed from one generation to the next. Years later, after studying abroad and returning home as a journalist, I came back determined to separate myth from reality. One assignment would change my life forever. It started with a phone call from a retired pastor living outside Enugu. His voice was calm, but there was an urgency beneath every word. There is something happening, he said. People keep talking about it, but no one wants to tell the whole story. I expected another rumor. Instead, I found a small community where nearly everyone described the same strange pattern. Families who gathered every evening to pray together spoke of an overwhelming sense of peace. Others claimed they felt watched whenever they mocked those gatherings. Some insisted that fear vanished the moment sincere prayer began. None of it sounded like evidence. It sounded like folklore. That was exactly why I accepted the assignment. For weeks I interviewed dozens of people, teachers, shopkeepers, farmers, doctors, young adults, grandparents. Many disagreed about details. But one observation kept appearing. Whenever they described moments of intense prayer, they mentioned something surprisingly ordinary, hands lifted, not dramatically, not as a ritual, simply open, raised in surrender. At first I laughed. Surely that couldn't be the centerpiece of every story. Yet every interview circled back to the same image. An elderly woman smiled as she remembered. My husband always said, she told me, empty hands remind us we have nothing to hide and everything to receive. Another man shook his head. I never understood why my mother prayed that way, he admitted. But those evenings changed our family. I filled notebook after notebook. Still, I remained unconvinced. As a reporter, patterns alone weren't enough. I needed something more. One rainy evening, while organizing my notes, I received another anonymous message. If you really want answers, it read, come to the abandoned church outside Nansuka tomorrow night. Come alone. Every instinct told me not to go. Curiosity won. The church stood on a quiet hillside, weathered by decades of rain and neglect. Broken windows let moonlight spill across cracked wooden pews. The roof groaned with every gust of wind. No one was there. At least, that was what I believed. Then I heard footsteps. An older woman emerged from the shadows carrying a small lantern. She introduced herself simply as Esther. I've been expecting you, she said. I asked how she knew my name. She smiled but didn't answer. Instead, she asked a question. Why are you really here? I gave the obvious response. I'm investigating stories. She looked at me for several seconds before replying. No, you are searching because part of you hopes they are false, and another part fears they might not be. Her words unsettled me because they were uncomfortably close to the truth. Esther invited me to sit. For hours she spoke, not with dramatic claims, but with quiet conviction. She described people discovering hope after years of despair, families reconciling after decades of bitterness, communities rebuilding trust one act of forgiveness at a time. What struck me wasn't talk of mysterious forces, it was how often ordinary acts of faith transformed ordinary lives. Before dawn, she said something I wrote down immediately. People spend too much time fearing darkness. They forget that even a single candle changes the room. I asked whether she believed raising hands during prayer possessed some hidden power. She shook her head. The hands themselves are not the point. They're a reminder that pride loosens its grip when we admit we cannot carry every burden alone. That answer disappointed me. It wasn't sensational, it was simple. Perhaps too simple. As the sun began to rise, Esther handed me a worn notebook. Read this, she said. It contains stories collected over 40 years. Some are ordinary. Some are difficult to explain. But all of them point to the same question. What changes inside a person when they truly surrender? I looked up to ask another question. She was already walking away through the morning fog. I never saw her again. Back in my apartment, I opened the notebook. Most entries described everyday struggles, fear, grief, loneliness, broken relationships. But one page caught my attention. Across the top, written in faded ink, were 6 words. The night fear finally lost its voice. I had no idea that reading the next page would begin an investigation, unlike anything I had ever imagined. And what I discovered next would force me to question not only the stories I had been chasing, but also the assumptions I had carried for years. The notebook smelled of age, cedar wood, and dust. Some pages were stained by rain. Others carried careful handwriting in different inks, suggesting they had been written over many years by different people. Dates stretched back decades. Most entries were ordinary accounts of families finding hope after hardship, neighbors reconciling after long disputes, or individuals describing moments that strengthened their faith. Then I reached the page titled, The Night Fear Finally Lost Its Voice. There was no author's name, only a date, October 17, no year. The account began with a simple sentence. If anyone ever tells you that courage feels like the absence of fear, they have never stood in the middle of the unknown. I leaned closer. According to the journal, a small prayer gathering had taken place in a farming community several miles from the church. Heavy rain had trapped nearly 20 people inside a modest wooden home. With roads flooded, they remained together late into the evening. The writer described the atmosphere changing after midnight, not with dramatic lights, not with thunder, but with an overwhelming feeling that everyone in the room sensed at exactly the same moment. Silence. One child reportedly stopped crying. An elderly man paused in the middle of speaking. Even the wind outside seemed to fade. The writer admitted there was no explanation for it. Then came another sentence that caught my attention. Nobody planned to raise their hands. It happened naturally, one person at a time, as though surrender had become easier than fear. I closed the notebook. As a journalist, I had learned to question emotional storytelling. People often remember feelings more vividly than facts. Still, something about these entries felt different. There was no attempt to exaggerate, no effort to convince, just observations. The next morning I drove toward the village mentioned in the notebook. Many of the older homes remained exactly as they had decades earlier. Children played soccer on dusty roads. Vendors greeted strangers with warm smiles. Nothing suggested the place held extraordinary stories, until I met Daniel. He owned a tiny repair shop near the market square. When I mentioned the old prayer gathering, his expression changed immediately. You found that notebook. I froze. You know about it. He nodded slowly. My grandmother helped write some of those accounts. I expected him to dismiss everything as folklore. Instead, he surprised me. You won't understand those stories if you're looking for spectacles, he said. They're about people changing. Daniel invited me into the shop. Old radios, clocks, and lanterns covered the shelves. As he repaired a weathered transistor radio, he shared a memory from childhood. I was 9 years old, he said. My father lost nearly everything after a terrible harvest. He stopped talking. He stopped laughing. He barely slept. Everyone expected our family to leave. I listened carefully. Daniel continued. My grandmother gathered us in the living room. There were no famous speakers, no special music, no miracle promises, just prayer. I noticed his eyes drifting toward the window as though replaying the memory. My mother did the same. Then my sisters. My father resisted. He thought it looked foolish. Daniel smiled, but eventually he lifted his hands too. I asked what happened next. He laughed softly. Nothing. Lightning. No voices. We simply found peace. It didn't solve every problem overnight. The harvest didn't suddenly appear. But hope returned, and hope changed how we faced every challenge afterward. His answer wasn't what my editor wanted. There was no sensational headline, no mystery to solve. Yet I couldn't ignore the consistency. Every story pointed toward inner transformation rather than outward spectacle. As I prepared to leave, Daniel handed me a faded photograph. It showed dozens of villagers standing outside the old church. Many were smiling. Several had their hands raised during a song. On the back, someone had written, "The strongest people are those who surrender what they cannot control." That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. Driving back toward the city, dark clouds rolled across the hills. Rain began falling so heavily that visibility nearly disappeared. I pulled over beside an abandoned roadside cafe to wait out the storm. Inside, only one other traveler sat drinking tea. He noticed the notebook on my passenger seat. Interesting reading, he asked. It raises more questions than answers, I admitted. He chuckled. The best questions usually do. We spoke for nearly an hour. He introduced himself only as Samuel. Unlike the others, he had once been deeply skeptical of faith. I spent years trying to explain everything, he said. Then I realized explanation and meaning aren't always the same thing. Before leaving, he said something that echoed in my mind long after the rain had stopped. People often ask whether prayer changes circumstances. I think the deeper question is whether prayer changes the person facing those circumstances. That night I returned to my apartment and spread every note, interview, and photograph across the floor. A pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every story involved fear. Every story involved surrender. Every story involved people choosing hope when they had every reason to despair. But one loose page slipped from the back cover of the notebook. I was certain it hadn't been there before. Unlike the others, this page wasn't handwritten. It was typed. Across the top appeared a title that sent a chill through me. Case File 7. The Man Who Refused to Raise His Hands. Beneath the title was a single line. His story ended differently. I stared at those words for several seconds. Who was he? Why had his account been separated from the others? And why did someone want that story hidden? I took a deep breath, turned the page, and began to read, completely unaware that what came next would become the most difficult investigation of my career. I unfolded the typed page carefully. Unlike the handwritten journal entries, this document looked as though it had been produced on an old typewriter decades earlier. The paper had yellowed with age, and several letters had faded, but one sentence remained perfectly readable. Some people mistake surrender for weakness. They discover its true meaning only after they have exhausted every other option. Below it was a name, Ilyas Okafor, age 42. Occupation school principal, OP. No supernatural language, no dramatic claims, just facts. The report explained that Elias had become well known for his discipline, intelligence, and determination. He believed every problem could be solved through planning, education, and hard work. People respected him. Students admired him. But according to those who knew him, he carried one burden that no achievement seemed able to lift. He refused to ask anyone for help. His wife, Grace, appeared several times throughout the report. She was described as patient, hopeful, quietly faithful. Whenever their family faced hardship, she would encourage everyone to gather for prayer. Elias never stopped her. But he never joined either. He would simply stand near the doorway with his arms folded, watching, waiting, remaining distant. One paragraph had been underlined in pencil. He believed dependence made people smaller. He spent his life proving he could carry everything alone. I closed my eyes for a moment. That sentence felt painfully familiar, not because it described anything supernatural, because it described people I had met throughout my career. Successful, driven, respected, yet quietly overwhelmed. The next afternoon I drove to OP. The village had changed over the years, but the old primary school still stood at the center of town. Children laughed in the courtyard. Teachers prepared classrooms for the following week. When I asked about Ilyas Okafor, several older residents immediately recognized the name. He was one of the finest principals we ever had. One elderly teacher said, he expected excellence, but he expected perfection from himself. I asked whether anyone still remembered his family. The teacher pointed toward a small house surrounded by flowering trees. Grace still lives there. She welcomed me with remarkable kindness. Before I could explain why I had come, her eyes settled on the notebook in my hands. So, you finally found it. The question caught me off guard. You knew about these journals. She smiled gently. My husband helped preserve many of them. That answer surprised me. The report makes it sound as though he wanted nothing to do with prayer. He didn't, she replied. At least not in the beginning. She poured tea before continuing. I wasn't arrogant. I was afraid. I looked up, afraid. She nodded. He believed that if he admitted he needed help, everyone would lose confidence in him. So he carried every burden himself. He smiled for everyone else. But every night, he grew a little more tired. Grace stood and retrieved a worn leather Bible from a nearby shelf. Inside was an old family photograph. Elias stood in the center, tall, confident, surrounded by his wife and 2 children. Yet something about his expression felt distant, almost guarded. That picture, Grace said softly, was taken 6 months before everything changed. I asked what happened. She remained silent for several seconds, then answered. Our youngest daughter became seriously ill. The room fell quiet. Doctors searched for answers. Treatments helped only briefly. Weeks became months. Hospital visits replaced family outings. Bills accumulated. Friends offered assistance. Elias politely refused every offer. He kept saying the same words. Grace recalled, I'll handle it. Don't worry about us. We don't need anyone. Eventually, even his closest friends stopped asking. Not because they didn't care, because he never allowed them close enough. Grace looked out the window toward the fading afternoon sunlight. I wasn't praying because I believed it would instantly solve everything. I was praying because I needed strength for tomorrow. Your husband didn't understand that. He thought prayer was admitting defeat. I remembered Daniel's words. The strongest people are those who surrender what they cannot control. The same lesson appeared again, not through miracles, not through spectacle, through ordinary people facing extraordinary pressure. Grace opened another page inside the Bible. A small handwritten note slipped onto the table. It was signed by Elias himself. The handwriting was firm but uneven. If my children ever read this, tell them strength is not pretending you never become tired. Real strength begins the moment you stop carrying the world by yourself. I read those words twice. Then a third time, Grace smiled sadly. He wrote that near the end of his illness. I looked up. I thought your daughter was the one who became sick. She was. Grace's voice grew quieter. But while caring for her, my husband ignored his own health. He collapsed one morning while teaching. Silence filled the room. He recovered. She nodded. Eventually. But that experience changed him forever. For the first time in years, he joined us during evening prayer. Not because someone convinced him, not because he lost an argument, because he realized control had limits. Hope did not. As the evening drew to a close, Grace walked me to the front gate. Just before I left, she handed me a sealed envelope. There is one more account. I promised not to share it unless someone sincerely wanted to understand these stories. I looked at the front. Only 5 words were written across the envelope. Read this one last. Driving home beneath a sky filled with stars, I couldn't stop thinking about everything I had heard. These stories weren't asking me to suspend reason. They were asking a different question. What happens when people stop believing they must face every burden alone? When I finally reached my apartment, I placed the sealed envelope on my desk. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. Another part wondered whether I was ready, because somehow I had the growing feeling that the final story wasn't about Elias, or Grace, or Esther. It was about me, and once I broke that seal, there would be no turning back. I didn't open the envelope that night. Instead, I placed it on my desk and stared at it for nearly an hour. It wasn't fear that stopped me, it was hesitation. For weeks, every interview had challenged assumptions I had carried for years. Not because I had witnessed anything impossible, but because I had met people whose lives had been transformed by humility, perseverance, forgiveness, and faith. The envelope felt different, personal, almost as though it had been waiting for someone. Finally, just after sunrise, I broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter, no signature, no date, only a title. To the one who thinks this story is about someone else. I began reading. If you are holding this letter, you have spent enough time collecting other people's stories. Now you must ask what story you are living. I stopped. The words landed harder than I expected. You have interviewed families who found peace. You have spoken with people who learned to surrender. You have searched villages, churches, and forgotten roads looking for answers. But you have carefully avoided asking yourself the same questions. A strange feeling settled over me. It was impossible for the writer to know me. And yet, every sentence felt uncomfortably familiar. The letter continued. Knowledge is valuable. Curiosity is honorable. But there comes a moment when observation must become participation. Otherwise, you spend your life standing outside every meaningful experience, taking notes while everyone else is transformed. I folded the page. Those words followed me throughout the day. That afternoon, I met my editor in the city, expected dramatic headlines. So he asked, "Did you uncover the mystery?" I hesitated. I uncovered something. He leaned forward. "Stories new. Secret societies. New." He frowned. "Then what?" I searched for the right words. I found ordinary people choosing hope instead of despair. His expression changed immediately. "That's not the story people click on." Maybe he was right. Stories built on fear spread quickly. Stories about quiet transformation rarely became headlines. As I walked back through the crowded streets, I noticed something I had overlooked before. People everywhere were carrying invisible burdens. A businessman arguing loudly on the phone, a mother trying to comfort a crying child, an elderly man sitting alone on a bench, students rushing between classes. Everyone seemed to be carrying something. Some burdens could be seen, others couldn't. That evening I returned to the abandoned church where I had first met Esther. The building looked exactly as it had before. Broken walls, empty pews, or so I thought. A small group had gathered inside. No stage, no microphones, no elaborate ceremony. Just neighbors sitting together. One person read a passage from the Bible. Another shared how friends had supported his family through difficult months. A young woman spoke about learning to forgive someone she never thought she could forgive. No one tried to impress anyone. No one claimed to have all the answers. When they finished speaking, an older gentleman quietly said, "Whatever burdens you've carried here tonight, you don't have to carry them alone." Several people closed their eyes. Some clasped their hands. Others simply sat quietly. A few slowly raised their hands. Not dramatically, not as a performance, but as a simple expression of surrender. Watching them, I finally understood what Esther had meant. It had never been about a particular gesture. The raised hands weren't presented as a source of power. They were a visible reminder of something happening inside a person, a willingness to let go of the illusion of complete control, a willingness to admit, "I cannot carry everything by myself." For the first time since beginning my investigation, I closed my own notebook, not because the story was over, because, for once, I wasn't observing. I was simply present. The room remained quiet for several minutes. No extraordinary event occurred, no dramatic spectacle. Yet when people began leaving, something had undeniably changed. Faces that had entered carrying exhaustion now carried calm. Conversations were warmer. Laughter returned. People embraced one another before walking home beneath the evening sky. Outside the church, I noticed an inscription carved into an old stone near the entrance. The weather had nearly erased the words, but they were still readable. "Hope grows strongest in hearts that choose surrender over fear." I smiled. Perhaps that sentence summarized every interview, every journal entry, every conversation. The mystery had never been about supernatural displays. It had been about ordinary people discovering extraordinary resilience through faith, community, and humility. As I prepared to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. No one was there. Only a gentle breeze moved through the trees. Then I noticed something tucked beneath the church door. Another envelope. Unlike the first one, this one contained only a single sentence. "Every story eventually becomes someone's invitation." I looked toward the empty road stretching into the distance. For weeks I had searched for answers in forgotten villages and old journals. Now I realized the final chapter had never been hidden in any of those places. It had been waiting inside the question I had avoided asking myself from the very beginning. And the answer would determine what I wrote next. For several days, I didn't write a single word. My editor called twice. Friends asked whether I had finished the investigation. I always gave the same answer: "Not yet." The truth was harder to explain. The facts were complete. The interviews were complete. The notebook had revealed everything it was meant to reveal. What remained unfinished was me. One quiet morning, I returned to the hillside overlooking the abandoned church. The rainy season had passed. The sky was clear. Children's laughter echoed from the nearby village. Life had continued exactly as it always had. Only I had changed. I carried Esther's notebook one final time. Every page told a different story. A family restored after years of bitterness. A teacher who discovered purpose after failure. A widow who found hope after unimaginable grief. A young man who forgave the person responsible for his father's death. None of them described perfect lives. None claimed every problem disappeared overnight. Their stories shared something far more believable. They learned that faith did not remove every storm. It changed how they walked through the storm. As I closed the notebook for the last time, a folded photograph slipped onto the ground. I had never seen it before. It showed the old church many years earlier. Nearly 50 people stood outside, young, old, rich, poor, different backgrounds, different stories. One thing connected them. Not every person had their hands raised. Some clasped them quietly. Some simply stood with heads bowed. Others smiled toward the camera. On the back of the photograph were words written in faded blue ink. The posture of the hands matters less than the posture of the heart. I read the sentence 3 times. Then I laughed softly. After weeks of searching for hidden meanings, the simplest lesson had been there all along. People often ask whether lifting hands changes God. Perhaps the better question is whether surrender changes us. Whether releasing pride creates room for compassion. Whether admitting weakness opens the door for healing. Whether choosing hope breaks the cycle of fear. Those questions cannot be measured in a laboratory, but they can be witnessed in ordinary lives. Later that afternoon, I delivered my manuscript to my editor. He skimmed the first few pages. Finally, he looked up, expected. I know. There are no shocking confessions, no secret organizations, no impossible claims. I smiled, because that's not what I found. He remained silent for several moments. Then he asked, "So what did you find?" I looked through the office window toward the crowded streets below. I found that people are stronger together than alone. I found that humility often accomplishes what pride never can. I found that forgiveness frees the one who forgives. And I found that sincere faith can give people courage to face circumstances they once believed would destroy them. He leaned back in his chair. "Do you think people will read it?" "I don't know, but I think someone needs to." A month later, the article was published. It never became a worldwide sensation. It didn't dominate headlines. Yet letters began arriving. One came from a firefighter who said the story reminded him to reconnect with his family. Another came from a nurse who had nearly abandoned her faith after losing patients she cared deeply about. A university student wrote that she had spent years believing asking for help made her weak. An elderly man admitted he had not spoken to his brother in 18 years. After reading the article, he made the call. Not every letter described dramatic change. Some simply said, "Thank you. Your story gave me hope. I needed this today." One evening, nearly a year after my investigation ended, I visited the old church one final time. The building had been repaired. Fresh paint covered the weathered walls. Children played outside while neighbors shared a meal together. It no longer felt abandoned. As I prepared to leave, I noticed an elderly woman arranging flowers near the entrance. For a moment, she reminded me of Esther. I walked closer. "Excuse me," I asked. "Did you know a woman named Esther who used to come here?" The woman smiled warmly. "Oh, yes. Everyone knew Esther. She always believed stories could build bridges between strangers." I looked around. "Where is she now?" The woman pointed toward the hillside cemetery overlooking the valley. "She passed away 3 years ago." My heart skipped. 3 years. That couldn't be. I had met Esther only months earlier, hadn't I? Confused, I thanked the woman and walked toward the small cemetery. Near the highest point stood a simple stone. It bore only a name, Esther Wosu, and beneath it, one final inscription: "Carry hope farther than fear." I stood there in silence. Had I misunderstood the timeline? Had someone else met me at the church? Or had memory blurred details over time? I never found an answer. Perhaps some mysteries remain unsolved, not to frighten us, but to remind us that not everything meaningful can be reduced to certainty. As the sun dipped below the hills, golden light spread across the valley. Families walked home together. Children laughed. Church bells echoed softly in the distance. I realized my investigation had begun with a search for extraordinary secrets. It ended with an appreciation for ordinary acts of faith, kindness, courage, and community. The notebook remains on my bookshelf to this day. Its pages are worn, its cover is faded. Whenever someone asks me whether the stories inside are true, I give the only honest answer I can. Some details may have changed with time, some memories may have been imperfect, but the hope they inspired in people, that was real, and perhaps that is the truest part of any story.